"You're left with $20, Daddy," my son said mockingly, already preparing to inherit his mother's fortune of roughly $1.5 billion. I waited in silence while the lawyer turned the page and continued reading. His face went pale. "This story is based on real events. Friends, write where you're watching from and how old you are. It's very interesting to know who's listening. Enjoy." "Keep those $20, Dad." That was the last sentence my son said, in that smug voice of a man who was about to take ownership of almost his mother's entire multi-million-dollar fortune. He wanted me to sit in the front row at the reading of the will, not out of respect, of course, but purely for the spectacle. He wanted to see, with his own eyes, how an official document, stamped and signed by a notary, would seal my complete, final, legally confirmed worthlessness. The only thing Stuart didn't know back then was that my ex-wife Jennifer, even from beyond the grave, had managed to make one last move, and in that move, I was the central figure. The sound of the planer was my only symphony. For the past few years, that noise had become the background of every single day, as if someone were slowly and stubbornly drawing a bow across the same string over and over again. Each sharp screech of the blade against the wood became a note, each curling strip of walnut a separate line in my silent poem. There, in a small workshop on the edge of a settlement near Seattle, I had long since stopped being a failed architect. I had stopped being an erased husband. I was simply a carpenter, a man who put together something solid and honest from other people's broken pieces. My hands, rough, scarred with scraped knuckles, knew the truth about wood in a way no expert ever could. Wood never lies. It never pretends to be better than it is. It just exists, with its knots, its cracks, its resin, with places where the grain runs against you and resists to the very end. You guide the planer, feel where it gives in and where it fights back, and if you don't force it but listen instead, at some point, the board itself tells you what shape it wants to become. There was something calming in that, something honest. In a world where people betrayed so easily, wood was the only thing I'd never had a single argument with. The planer stopped so abruptly that my ears rang. I turned off the machine, and in the sudden silence, I could hear only my own breathing and the dull hum of the highway somewhere far away. On the workbench lay a half-finished rocking chair, a wide, warm walnut chair I was making for a young couple who had just taken out a mortgage and were dreaming of their first real home. I ran my palm along the curved back, feeling the smooth transition from edge to arc, and was about to pick up the planer again when my phone vibrated in the pocket of my old work overalls. The sound felt foreign in this space. My phone almost never rang here. The few people I still kept in touch with knew a simple rule. If you want something from George Watson, it's better to come in person. I wiped my hands on a rag, pulled out the battered smartphone, and looked at the screen. On the small matte glass, 2 words glowed in cold black letters, making something under my ribs tighten. Stuart Watson. Stuart, my son. So many years had passed. So many years without a single call that wasn't an ultimatum, a demand, an accusation. So many winters without cards. So many of his birthdays and mine, Christmas after Christmas, and between us only a long, deafening pause, brick by brick, built out of resentment, shame, and the words we had both failed to swallow back then. I had long decided that this silence would last until one of us was lowered into the ground. It seemed I was only wrong about who would call first. I took a deep breath. The air smelled of wood shavings and slightly damp boards, and slid my thumb across the screen to accept the call. "Hello," I said. My voice sounded hoarse, rough, as if it wasn't coming through a phone line but straight out of the board under the planer. The voice on the other end was sharp, stretched tight like a string, one that well-paid communication coaches had long ago trained to sound confident and ruthless. In that voice, there was no trace of my settlement or the woods behind my house. There were Seattle skyscrapers, glass-ceiling conference rooms, and expensive ties. "George," he said. Not Dad. Not for many years now. Just George, said as if it were an extra last name on a list, a random person in line who had somehow lingered too long. Mom is dead. Not a hint of grief, no tension, just a dry statement, like the weather on the radio. He delivered the sentence with the same indifference a newsreader uses when reading off a teleprompter. A week ago. Stroke. It was quick. I stood by the workshop window, looking out at the yard flooded with pale sunlight. The snow hadn't fallen yet. Wet leaves covered the ground, and the old cherry tree cast a crooked shadow on the leaning fence. A strange numbness washed over me. Jennifer was dead. Those words refused to stand next to each other. In my mind, Jennifer was still the one I remembered. A whirlwind, a storm, bright, brilliant, merciless. A woman who loved designing buildings and destroying lives with equal passion. To imagine her simply dead felt not even rude, almost absurd. Are you listening to me? Irritation crept into Stuart's voice. The funeral was last week. Why? I swallowed, my tongue sticking to the roof of my mouth. Why didn't anyone tell me? He cut me off without the slightest mercy. You weren't on the list, he said, tossing the words away like a useless part into the trash. Listen, I'm not calling about that. The lawyer requires your presence at the reading of the will. This Friday, exactly at 10 a.m., Settle and Chernoff offices downtown. Try not to be late. This wasn't a call to offer condolences. It wasn't even an attempt to share the news. It was an order. A summons handed down by someone who had declared himself the master of a world where there was no longer any place for me. I forced my voice to stay steady. I have no reason to go there, Stuart. Jennifer and I divided everything a long time ago. All the legal dots were put in place years back. I have nothing of hers, and she has nothing of mine. What do you want from me? A short, dry chuckle burst from the speaker. It was hard to even call it laughter. A hollow, tinny sound with not a trace of amusement, only contempt filtered down to pure white. And that sound, more than any words, hit something in me that I'd been hiding deep down for years. Oh, trust me, he drawled. I know perfectly well you won't see a single cent. Don't play dumb. Mom hated you until her last day. But there are formalities. You need to be there in person and officially hear what you are to this family. A nobody. Zero. A legally confirmed zero. He paused briefly, letting the poison sink in properly. And personally, he added, and I could almost see the smirk on his face. Personally, I just want to look at you. I want to see that quiet little fake dignity of yours crack when they read it out loud. It's the only performance you're still capable of. There are many ways to humiliate someone, but this kind of carefully measured, polished cruelty, it didn't carry the pain of a son who once felt abandoned. There was only the cold thrill of a winner about to shove the loser's face into the dirt. I even caught myself thinking that I must have raised him perfectly, exactly the way Jennifer would have wanted. Done? I asked calmly. Too calmly, even for myself. Almost. His voice softened, almost affectionate, which made it even more disgusting. Don't worry about the trip back. I'll leave you $20 for the train. Consider it a farewell gift. The line went dead. A dull electronic tone replaced his voice. I stood there for a few more seconds with the phone pressed to my ear, listening to that empty, monotonous sound, before finally lowering my hand. Silence returned to the workshop, but it was no longer the same. Not the calm, woody silence where you can hear sawdust settling onto the floor. This one was heavy, suffocating, like the silence in a room where a door has just been slammed shut. Old anger, the feeling I had once buried under layers of wood shavings, daily routine, and resignation, slowly lifted its head. It wasn't a sudden blaze, not a fit of rage. It was more like a dull but intensely hot ember deep inside me, suddenly glowing again, slowly twisting into something bigger. Stuart wasn't inviting me to a reading of the will. He was inviting me to a public execution. Mine. He wanted a show. Fine. He would get his show. I carefully placed the phone on the edge of the workbench, the way you set down something that might burn you if you grab it too fast. I walked over to the rocking chair and ran my palm along the armrest. The wood beneath my fingers was warm and alive. A little more work, and the chair would be ready for the customers. They would rock in it, watch TV, argue, make up. Someone else's life, someone else's family. Behind me, the thin plywood door of the workshop slammed shut as I stepped outside. The day was the same as 1,000 days before it. Gray, damp, with a low sky that couldn't decide whether to finally bring snow or wait a little longer. In the garden stood bare black currant bushes. The old doghouse was empty. The dog had died a couple of years ago, without ever really being mourned by anyone. I walked around the house, went inside, and turned on the light in the small bedroom. On the hanger hung my only suit, the same gray one, almost graphite-colored. It had once been good wool, dense and heavy, the kind you hardly find in stores anymore. Too expensive, too durable. The suit was older than many of my customers. The shoulders sagged a little. The lining in the sleeves shone in places like silk from age. This was the suit I had worn to court, listening to Jennifer's lawyers divide our shared life into folders. I wore it again on the way back to an empty apartment. Since then, it had mostly hung untouched, smelling of dust and something else, a mix of office air, other people's money, and my own mistakes. I took it off the hanger and ran my hand along the lapel. I turned on the old iron, spread a sheet right on the bed, and slowly, like in my younger years, pressed every crease, smoothing not just the fabric, but my doubts as well. I sharpened the creases in the trousers until they were so crisp they could have cut paper. When I finished, the suit didn't look new, but it looked honestly cleaned and ready for one last appearance in public. On Friday morning, the trip into the city felt almost unreal, like a dream that couldn't decide whether it was about the past or the future. The commuter train knocked dully along the tracks, bare fields, gray apartment blocks, crossings and gas stations flashing by outside the window. I sat by the window, my hand resting on the worn leather handle, and thought about how I used to travel to Seattle on architectural business, blueprints under my arm, a sense of purpose, a feeling that I was needed. Now I was going there as an unnecessary witness, summoned purely to check a box, my reaction expected as cheap entertainment. Leaving the station, I stepped outside and breathed in the damp, sharp air of downtown. The sky hung low like a leaden lid, and wind from the bay cut through my unbuttoned coat. I reached the business district on the waterfront by taxi. The driver stayed silent, the radio muttering some endless talk show at low volume. When the car stopped in front of the right building, the number on the meter made my eyes sting. For that money, I was used to buying lumber for half a month. But I silently counted out the bills, placed them in the outstretched hand, and got out. The Settle and Chernoff building looked exactly the way I had imagined it. It didn't just occupy the corner of the block, it owned it. A tall wall of dark glass and gray stone, without a single unnecessary detail, as if someone had grown a vertical cliff here, polished it to a shine, and set it to guard other people's money and other people's power. I pushed the heavy glass door. The street noise was cut off as if by a knife. Inside was a special kind of silence, not living, like in a forest, but the kind you find in museums or temples, where the space itself forces you to whisper. The lobby was a true cathedral nave, built in honor of money. The floor was a single stretch of pale stone, polished so perfectly it reflected the ceiling lights and people's silhouettes, making them taller and thinner than in real life. The walls, paneled in dark wood, gleamed with oil and old lemon wax, and somewhere in the air lingered a faint smell of polish and long evaporated expensive tobacco. All my life, I had designed buildings. I knew how space worked, how lines, light, and height could press down on you, or on the contrary, support you. But I had never drawn a place like this. This space wasn't meant for people, not for living. It was designed to suppress, to to remind everyone who entered. You are small, you are here by accident. Real decisions are made far above your level. That was exactly how I felt. Small. I was wearing my only gray suit. The fabric was still solid, but the shoulders no longer fit the way they once had. The sleeves were a bit too long, the collar of the shirt worn smooth. I had ironed it myself that morning on the bed in my house outside town, making sure at least the crease in the trousers looked perfect. But no matter how hard you try, you can't iron time out of a suit. This was the same suit from our divorce trial. The last time I wore it, I saw Jennifer in person. The last time I saw anything alive in her eyes, not just icy contempt. The suit smelled of dust and something else, a strange mix of preservation and decay. As I walked toward the reception desk, the old leather soles of my shoes tapped dryly against the stone. In that silence, the sound felt too loud, almost indecent, like coughing in church. A few young people in perfectly tailored suits, a man and a woman, looked up from their phones, let their eyes slide over me, and immediately returned their gaze to the screens. To them, I was neither a client nor a threat, just an old man who had wandered into the wrong place. I felt like a greasy stain on a white sheet of paper, a drop of ink on a perfectly calibrated contract, a foreign element in an impeccably assembled picture. And suddenly, I understood clearly. This was exactly what Stuart wanted, to drag me onto his territory, into this glass fortress, where every detail would remind me of my lost life. Reaching the desk, which looked like a block of pale stone cut straight from a mountain, I stopped and leaned forward slightly, like someone who already expects to be told he's in the wrong place. Behind the desk sat a young blonde woman with a thin earpiece that blended so closely with her skin it seemed like part of her body. She was typing quickly, not even looking up. "I have an appointment at 10, I said, hearing the rasp in my own voice, rough like an unplaned board under sandpaper. "The reading of Jennifer Benez's will. My name is George Watson." I could see the last name click in her head. She recognized it, but not the face. Her expression made it clear the picture didn't add up for her. She had clearly been expecting someone who looked like Stuart, someone who fit naturally into this glass world, not someone like me. For a second, confusion flickered in her eyes, instantly replaced by a faint, barely noticeable contempt. And then, over everything, the rehearsed mask of polite service slid into place. "Of course," she said, smiling in a way that never reached her eyes, stopping somewhere around her lips. "Attorney Settle is already expecting you. Please have a seat. Someone will come for you shortly." She nodded toward the waiting area, where low black leather sofas stood around a massive glass table. I sat on the very edge of one of them. The leather beneath me was cold and stiff, as if these sofas had been strictly instructed not to relax along with the guests. I laced my fingers together, resting my rough, work-darkened hands on the old fabric of my trousers, and looked at the paintings on the walls, patches of color, lines, geometry. Not a single recognizable tree, not a single house, just expensive splashes of color covering empty space. I sat there like a ghost, like a remnant of some past life that everyone present had long since crossed out and tried to forget. I was waiting to be officially told, with a stamp and a seal, that I was nobody, that I was worth absolutely nothing. That was exactly what Stuart had promised me over the phone, and the memory made the warm ember of anger inside flare just a little, licking up with a tongue of flame. I already knew. I hadn't come here to be humiliated. I had come to finish something. They didn't just enter the waiting area, they made an entrance, like stepping onto a stage. It was Stuart, and of course, he wasn't alone. He moved with that undeserved confidence given by a life in which no one has ever truly told you no. With the smug ease of a man used to the world, adjusting itself to his stride. He was wearing a dark blue designer suit, some fashionable Italian brand, no doubt, worth more than I made in several months in my workshop. The suit fit perfectly, highlighting a body shaped not by physical labor and lack of sleep, but by personal trainers and fitness clubs. His hair was slicked back with expensive gel, a gold and steel watch gleamed on his wrist, and his face carried the frozen expression of a man who genuinely believes everyone owes him by default. Behind him came his accessories. First, an overly thin, overly bright girl, the kind of deliberate, artificial beauty sculpted by makeup artists and cosmetologists. She wore a tight, outrageously expensive sheath dress, thin but obviously costly bracelets on her neck and wrists, and without looking up, she scrolled through something on her phone with her thumb, as if everything happening around her was just background noise to her feed. Second came a man in his early 40s, with an unnaturally even tan for our October and teeth so white they looked painted on. His smile was fixed and predatory, like a shark's on a billboard. Even without introductions, I knew. This was his financial advisor, John, the man who helped my son count other people's money. They didn't look like a family in mourning. Number. What I saw was a pack of predators circling prey they already considered theirs. Stuart confidently walked up to the reception desk, not even glancing in my direction. "Stuart Watson," his voice rang out under the high ceiling like a public announcement. "I have an appointment with Attorney Settle." The receptionist, the same one who had barely looked at me, suddenly came alive, turning into pure attentiveness and courtesy. "Yes, of course, Mr. Watson. One moment, Mr. Watson. We'll prepare everything right away. Please go ahead and have a seat," she chirped, as if someone had flipped a switch. He had already turned to take a seat on one of the sofas when his eyes finally landed on me. He froze for a second. Then a cruel smile slowly spread across his face, like stretched rubber. A cat's grin after cornering a mouse and savoring its helplessness. He walked toward me unhurriedly, his expensive shoes making almost no sound on the mirror-smooth stone. His two companions followed, glancing at me sideways with interest. "I can't believe it," he said loudly enough for the entire room to hear. "You actually came?" His gaze slid over me from head to toe, lingering on the old suit, the worn shirt collar, the shoes that should have been taken to a cobbler a long time ago. "Well, yeah," he went on, half turning toward the girl. "Kaylee, looks like he really does need those couple of thousand, huh?" Kaylee finally looked up from her phone, twisted her mouth into a smile worn thin by TV shows, and let out a short, sharp laugh, like the crack of shattering glass. John's grin widened even more. He looked at me not as a person, but like an old piece of furniture that needed to be hauled out, thrown away, and replaced with something new. He didn't even think about offering a hand. His gaze was cold and precise, like an appraiser estimating how much longer this rickety cabinet might last. Stuart gestured toward me with a half-turn, speaking no longer to me, but to his companions. "This," he paused, and the pause itself sounded like an insult, "is my father." He said the word father as if it were an unpleasant diagnosis, an unfortunate biological accident that couldn't be fully hidden and had to be acknowledged. This wasn't for me, it was for them. He was apologizing to them for my existence, for my old suit, for my shoes, for the fact that a man stood beside him who in no way reflected his polished shine. A very different Stuart surfaced in my memory. Small, about 10 years old, still without a tan, without these masks on his face. It was a morning close to Christmas. For weeks, back in my old, still city-based workshop, I had been making him a gift, an enormous, detailed model of a battleship. I carved every turret, every mast by hand, glued them, sanded them smooth. When I placed the box under the tree, I felt that rare, almost childish pride an adult man sometimes feels. Stuart opened it, looked for exactly 2 seconds, and pushed it aside. "It's not branded," he said with dissatisfaction. "I want one like my classmates have." Jennifer, always ready to solve any problem with money, brought him an expensive game console within an hour. And while he excitedly hooked it up to the TV, My battleship box stayed off to the side, slowly gathering dust. That was the first time I clearly felt that my son and I lived in different coordinate systems. Back then, I still hoped our paths might someday cross. I was wrong. Another person entered the waiting area, and the air seemed to change, growing thicker and colder. The sound of footsteps, the rustle of clothing, faded on its own. In the doorway stood a tall man in his late 50s or early 60s, wearing a perfectly gray suit that didn't shout about its cost, but calmly stated authority and professional confidence. This was Attorney Settle. His face was like a judge's, still, restrained, almost a mask, but his eyes didn't just look, they evaluated, weighed you, placed you on internal scales and mentally sorted you into folders. A quiet but palpable confidence radiated from him, the kind that needs neither gold nor loud words. Even Stewart straightened slightly, as if an invisible finger had poked him between the shoulder blades. Settle's gaze moved slowly across the room like a scanner beam. It caught Stewart and his entourage but didn't linger, as if they were part of the decor, just more expensive chairs. Then it stopped on me. For a brief moment, something flickered in his expression. Not pity, no, but understanding, as if he already knew the weight of what I was carrying. He walked over to me. "Mr. Watson," he said calmly, with respect, without haste, the way you address someone whose presence matters. "Thank you for taking the time to come." He didn't offer his hand, but the words themselves felt like a handshake, a simple acknowledgement that I had the right to be here. Only then did he turn to my son. "Mr. Watson," he repeated in the same voice, but the tone was different now, colder, more formal, stripped of warmth. An ordinary person might not have noticed the difference, but Stewart's entire world rested on fragile supports of special treatment and status. The fact that I had been acknowledged first, not him, was a small challenge thrown his way. I saw irritation flash in his eyes, his jaw tighten slightly. He immediately tried to cover it with a fresh wave of arrogant contempt. "Let's get this over with, Settle," he snapped in the tone of an owner giving orders. "I have a table at a trendy restaurant. Still need to celebrate. I'm not planning to be late." The lawyer's face didn't change by a millimeter. "As you wish," he replied evenly, opening the heavy conference room door. "Gentlemen, please." The conference room was just as cold and oppressive as the lobby, but here that coldness was mixed with a sense of finality. In the center stood a single massive table of dark wood, polished to a mirror shine, its surface like black water without a ripple. One entire wall was made of floor-to-ceiling windows, but instead of a view of the sky or the bay, they looked out onto the gray wall of a neighboring tower, as if someone had deliberately made sure no one would entertain any illusions of freedom. This was a room designed to sign sentences disguised as contracts and grind opponents into dust. Without hesitation, Stewart took the seat at the far end of the table opposite the door, the place usually reserved for the head of the family. He leaned back, spread his arms across the armrests, like a man claiming all the space. Kaylee and John settled on either side of him, slightly lower, like a scaled-down throne. I chose a chair closer to the entrance, off to the side, where secretaries or witnesses usually sit, people whose opinions don't matter. Settle took his seat at the head of the table, placed a thick folder in front of him, carefully removed his glasses, wiped the lenses with a soft cloth, put them back on, and unhurriedly opened the documents. A silence settled over the room, taut like a stretched string. I could hear only my own breathing and the quiet, irritated tapping of Stewart's fingernail on the armrest. "Let us begin," the lawyer said, his voice becoming flat and dry, as befits someone reading a legal text. "The last will and testament of Jennifer Benny's is hereby announced." The show began. Settle's voice was straight as a ruler line. No unnecessary curves, no emotion, only dry law that doesn't care whether you like it or not. "It is hereby announced," he began, The last will and testament of Jennifer Benez, executed on August 4th of the current year. I, Jennifer Benez, being of sound mind and memory. I glanced sideways at Stuart. He was openly bored, reclined in his chair, staring at his expensive, gleaming Swiss watch, clearly already somewhere else, in the restaurant where he would soon celebrate his victory. To him, this was all a formality, a dull prelude to the moment when his name would be spoken and this perfectly polished world laid at his feet. First, Settle continued, I direct that all my lawful debts and all expenses related to my funeral be paid from the estate. Stuart sighed loudly, demonstratively rolling his wrist again to admire the watch face, a peacock spreading a tail it was already bored with. Second, Settle read on without changing his tone, I bequeath to my housekeeper, Ella Misner, the sum of $100,000 as a token of gratitude for her many years of faithful service and endless patience. I saw Stuart roll his eyes, lean toward John, and mutter something into his ear. I didn't catch the words, but his lips clearly shaped a very familiar one. Crumbs. I smiled to myself. I remembered Ella well. She had appeared back when money was only a distant outline on the horizon, before it began to pour in like a flood. A quiet, gentle woman who always knew when to step aside and when, without a word, to place a mug of strong coffee on the table. After my epic fights with Jennifer, I often found myself sitting on a stool in her kitchen, that same mug in my hands, while she silently sliced bread, pretending not to have heard dishes flying through the living room 5 minutes earlier. Ella saw everything, and if anyone deserved even a shred of gratitude from Jennifer, it was her. Third, Settle continued, I bequeath a substantial sum to an environmental foundation dedicated to preserving a migratory butterfly and bird sanctuary in the state of Washington. This time Kaylee came to life. She raised a perfectly shaped eyebrow, twisted her lips, and leaning toward Stuart, drawled in a whisper loud enough for me to hear, Butterflies? Seriously? Something tightened in my chest. Not hurt, not pity, something more complex. Layer by layer, an old, long-forgotten nostalgia rose up. Long ago, before Stuart, before all these glass offices and magazine articles, Jennifer and I had loaded an old Jeep with a couple of backpacks and driven deep into the state, to a small nature reserve. We slept in cheap cabins, ate soup from aluminum bowls, pushed through damp forest before dawn, climbed a low but exhausting hill until we finally reached a clearing. The air there was so thick with wings, it felt like the forest itself was trembling. Thousands of small, bright butterflies, birds, a soft rustle like a whisper. Jennifer stood in the middle of it all, her head tilted back, tears running down her cheeks. This is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, George, she said quietly back then. Like all the souls in the world are coming home. And now, all these years later, after lawyers, fights, and silence, she remembered not another contract or construction volume, but that day in the damp forest. This clause wasn't just a financial gesture, it was a cipher. A message. To whom? To me? To herself? I didn't know. But the fact that she included it meant that something alive in her had still remained. Fourth, Settle continued in the same even voice, I bequeath to my driver, Michael Hewitt, a substantial sum for his many years of impeccable service and for never once commenting aloud on the colorful guests my son brought home. Stuart flinched as if slapped. What kind of hint is that supposed to be? He snapped. John placed a calming hand on the sleeve of his jacket with professional ease, soothing a dog. It's nothing, Stuart, he murmured. A joke. It doesn't matter. But my son's face flushed red. The script he had carefully drawn in his head was starting to break down. In his plan, everything was supposed to revolve around him. His name, his triumph. Instead, the late Jennifer was wasting precious time on housekeepers, drivers, and some butterflies. Stuart's fingers began tapping rhythmically on the tabletop, a dry, irritated knock, like on a coffin lid. "Fifth," Settle went on, as if not noticing the tapping, "I bequeath my collection of first editions of Silver Age poets to the National Library, with the exception of one volume." He paused briefly, his eyes running over the lines. "A rare edition of poetry." Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Stuart lean forward slightly, no doubt thinking that now, finally, something was meant for him. A small special prize, a sign of recognition. But before Settle could finish the sentence, my son's palm slammed down on the table with a bang. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. Settle fell silent. He didn't flinch. He didn't frown. He simply raised his head from the page, very slowly. So slowly, it felt more frightening than any shout. He removed his glasses, carefully folded the temples, placed them beside the folder, and looked at Stuart across the table. "Mr. Watson," he said, in a completely different voice now. The dull legal monotone had turned to steel. "This is not a negotiation or a business meeting. This is the official reading of the last will of the deceased. I will read every word of this document exactly as your mother wrote it." He paused, coldly, personally. "And you," he added, "will sit and listen. Am I being clear?" Stuart's face turned an ugly, dark red. A man used to buying people and situations had just been publicly pulled up short, like a misbehaving boy at a parents' meeting. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and looked at John. John gave a barely noticeable shake of his head. The cage snapped shut. Settle held his gaze for another second, then put his glasses back on, calmly straightened the page, and took a small sip of water. He paused, not for himself, but for Stuart. Show him where the real center of gravity in this room was. "So," he said in the same even tone as before, "we continue. The fifth point." His eyes slid over the lines, and for a brief moment the corner of his mouth seemed to twitch. "Actually," he added calmly, "this subpoint was crossed out by your mother. We move on." If Stuart had been expecting some special gift, that hope died so quietly it didn't even need funeral music. "Sixth," Settle continued, his intonation shifting slightly, "regarding individuals personally connected to my son, Stuart Watson." I saw John unconsciously straighten up, adjust the lapel of his expensive jacket, and pull his trademark predatory smile back onto his face. Kaylee finally put her phone away. Her eyes lit up with greedy anticipation. Now, finally, the inner circle would be rewarded. There would be a slice of the pie for them, too. "To my financial advisor, Mr. John Broome," Settle read quietly but clearly, "I bequeath a monetary sum." He paused in such a way that the tension in the room became almost physical. John held his breath, squaring his shoulders. "Which I recommend be used to complete a thorough course in professional ethics," the lawyer finished calmly. "My personal financial records indicate that he would greatly benefit from revisiting the basics." I didn't even immediately register whether a specific amount had been mentioned. If it had, it dissolved in my ears into a single meaning: thief. John's face collapsed. His smile was wiped away completely, like marker from a glass board. His knuckles went white as he gripped the edge of the table, as if he might tear it off. "What the hell is this?" he breathed, turning to Stuart with eyes clouded by rage. He had just been publicly labeled a fraud in dry legal language, but Settle didn't even raise an eyebrow. His gaze shifted gently, but inevitably to Kaylee. "To my son's current companion, the citizen Kaylee," he continued, "I transfer ownership of a high-quality but counterfeit handbag, with which she attempted to replace my original designer bag in the wardrobe 1 month ago. If John had just been doused with ice water, Kaylee was hit with boiling water. Her carefully sculpted face instantly blotched. Her jaw dropped. She sucked in air and croaked, "That old woman is lying. How dare she? Shut up!" Stuart barked so loudly that his voice bounced off the wooden panels and the ceiling. He wasn't defending her, he was silencing her. This wasn't about her, it was about him, about the perfect image that was now cracking at the seams. His entourage was falling apart before his eyes, and it wasn't some outsider doing it. It was his own mother, from beyond the grave, with neat lines of legal text. "Who cares?" he hissed, leaning toward both of them. "None of this matters, these stupid jokes. Who gives a damn about a bag? Who cares about this pocket change?" He jerked his head toward John, as if brushing the problem aside, but his voice no longer had the confidence it carried at the entrance. It sounded angry, frayed. He locked his eyes on the lawyer again. "Next, settle. Stop wasting time on this trash. Let's get to my part." I sat motionless, and perhaps for the first time in many years, felt a strange, bitter kinship with Jennifer. This was the woman I had once married, not the victim our son had painted her as. Cold, precise, intelligent to the point of cruelty. She wasn't just handing out property. She was settling scores, carefully burning away everything around Stuart, his advisors, his girlfriends, his polished decor, until only naked, ravenous greed was left at the center. Clearing the table before the main course, Settle patiently waited for the shouting to die down. He looked at Stuart without expression. "As I said," he reminded him quietly, "I will read every word." He let the silence lie on the table between us a little longer. Then he turned the page. The paper rustled as if it weren't touching air, but someone's nerves. "Seventh point," he said, "regarding my son, Stuart Watson." Stuart leaned forward with his whole body. His fingers dug into the edge of the table, his joints whitening. He instantly forgot about the humiliated advisor and the exposed mistress. There was only one thing left in the world, the lawyer's mouth and the words about to come out of it. Settle adjusted his glasses slightly, looked down at the papers, and spoke in the same even voice, though I clearly caught a subtle added weight in it, as if the text under his fingers had suddenly grown denser. "Regarding my son, Stuart Watson," he read, "I, Jennifer Benes, confirm that he is our only joint child, the product of my marriage to George Watson." Stuart straightened, lifting his chin like a man finally hearing the line he had come for. Kaylee leaned closer again. John pulled his predator's mask back into place, trying to erase the humiliation he had just suffered. "And I acknowledge," Settle continued, "that since the divorce I have been his primary source of financial support, housing, education, and social status." There was no warmth in those words, just a dry statement of fact. But it was enough for Stuart. He was practically glowing, as if the inheritance figure had already been read aloud. "However," the lawyer continued, and that single word hung in the air like a heavy nail, "I cannot fail to record something else." He turned the page. From the tiny handwritten notes in the margins, I understood this was no draft. Jennifer had once carefully edited every sentence. "For many years," he read, "my son has preferred to believe a version of our family history convenient to him, in which he is the victim, I am a saintly martyr, and his father is the sole cause of all misfortune. This allowed him to avoid reflecting on his own decisions, to evade responsibility for his choice of company, of women, of friends, and for how and on what he spent money." I felt something stir inside me. In this paragraph, Jennifer's voice was especially clear, her habit of cutting people open the way a surgeon cuts tissue, unafraid of blood. I consciously did not interfere with this illusion, the lawyer's voice continued evenly, because it was easier for business, for maintaining appearances, and for avoiding confrontation with his childish resentment. I now consider this weakness of mine to be one of the greatest mistakes of my life. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Stuart's fingers tense against the tabletop. His perfect posture faltered slightly. For the first time, something like anxiety flickered across his face. "Nevertheless," Settle went on without pausing, It must be acknowledged that Stuart possesses certain abilities in conducting business, presenting himself to society, and maintaining status. He is accustomed to living in a world where everything is measured in money, and by suddenly depriving him of this instrument, we would not reform him, but merely create another angry, destructive force. I do not wish to release into the world yet another man who will spend his entire life blaming others. At those words, Stuart even smirked. There it was. See, Mom understands me, Mom appreciates me. Just hearing the phrase about an ability for business was enough for him to mentally tick a bold checkmark. Therefore, Settle continued calmly, the main part of my estate, with the exception of the specifically stated provisions, I bequeath to my son, Stuart Watson. There it was, the sentence they were waiting for. Kaylee exhaled as if she had been holding her breath the entire time and squeezed Stuart's hand under the table. John immediately shifted in his chair as if he had already forgotten what had just been read about ethics and courses. In an instant, all three of them came alive, filled with that particular excitement that appears when the smell of money becomes almost physical. He is to receive, Settle read, all my shares in design and construction companies, rights to trademarks, copyrights to completed and uncompleted projects, as well as funds in my accounts, minus the sums specified in the previous clauses. He went on. Offices, warehouses, vehicles, a country house, an apartment in a prestigious Seattle neighborhood, a share in resort property on the coast that Jennifer had once bought for her old age. The list was long, arranged in neat columns. A familiar, hungry gleam lit up Stuart's eyes. If he could, he would already be signing papers, issuing orders, selling, buying, expanding. I listened to all of it and unexpectedly caught myself feeling strangely calm. No envy, no pity, no longing. None of this property had had anything to do with me for a long time. Between me and those offices lay years of rupture, scandals, court hearings, and silence. I had lost Jennifer long before these glass towers, and no percentage in a company could bring that back. However, Settle's voice grew slightly heavier again. In transferring all this to my son, I must also record the following. He turned the page. It felt as if even the light in the room shifted, growing colder. I bequeath to him not only property, but also his own decisions, his own greed, his choice of external shine over inner honesty, he read. Everything he has done with his life, he will carry himself, without the right to blame anyone else. Stuart snorted. Well, Jennifer Benez, that's a bit much, he muttered, not even waiting for the paragraph to end. Decided to write a psychology lecture into a will? This isn't a personal growth seminar. But Settle seemed not to hear him. I am aware, he continued, that all these resources go to a person who has already shown that it is never enough for him, that a new car matters more to him than an old debt of gratitude, that he prefers listening to flatterers over those who tell him the truth. I leave him my world as he helped make it, cold, polished, without roots. If that is not enough for him, let him add to it as he knows how. I watched each word cut into my son like a knife into dry wood. At first he tried to brush it off, to smile, to twist his mouth, but the further the lawyer read, the more tense Stuart's face became. At some point, he stopped looking at his watch, at Kaylee, at John. He stared straight at the tabletop, and only a faint twitch of his eyelid betrayed that everything was still getting through. In conclusion of this clause, Settle said, I wish to record one thing. My son receives from me everything that he believes he has always deserved, and along with it, full responsibility for how he uses it. There will be no further explanations, justifications, or discussions on this matter. He paused. The room fell into such silence that you could hear plastic quietly vibrating somewhere in the ventilation. Is that it? John broke the silence first, his voice hoarse and raw. I mean, regarding Stuart? Settle bent over the pages. Yes, he answered calmly. The clause concerning the son is complete. Stuart exhaled loudly and leaned back in his chair as if he had just stepped out of cold water. He had gotten what he wanted. The bulk of the estate was his. All the barbs, all the phrases about greed and responsibility, he had already mentally pushed aside like fine print in a contract. He turned sharply toward me, his face filled once again with that same cruel, sweet confidence. "So," he said loudly, drawing out the words, "how does it feel, George?" Triumphant anger boiled in his voice. "Did you hear? Mom, despite everything, trusted me with it all. The entire world you built together, and then you managed to collapse. Everything you lost, everything that will never belong to you again." He tilted his head, studying me like an exhibit. "And you know what's the funniest part?" he went on. "Here, in these papers, you're not even mentioned. You're just not there, as if you never existed. No houses, no accounts, no cars, no shares, nothing. Zero. Empty space." He deliberately raised his hand and snapped his fingers, like calling a waiter. "That's it," he said. "And that's all? That's your price, George. Zero." Kaylee snorted again, her eyes lighting up with childish delight at someone else's humiliation. John pressed his lips together in contempt, clearly relieved to focus on who got what, rather than on what had just been read about him. I looked at my son and suddenly realized with surprise, inside, there was nothing. No crushing, soul-draining hurt. No bitter regret. No urge to justify myself. Only the fatigue of someone who knows this performance too well, knows who wrote the script, and how many nerves were once spent on rehearsals. "I'm glad you're satisfied," I said quietly. "At least with something in your life." He jerked as if I had struck him with a slap, not a hard one, but a very precise one. "You really think," Stuart hissed, "that your cheap lines mean anything in this world anymore?" I didn't have time to answer. Settle, who had been silently observing until now, neatly drew a line under the paragraph. "Gentlemen," he reminded them, "let us return to the substance of the proceedings." Stuart, without taking his furious eyes off me, finally sat up straighter, demonstratively turning away so as not to see me even out of the corner of his eye. Settle flipped through several pages, checked signatures, dates, concise notes at the bottom of the sheets, then placed the entire thick stack of papers back into the folder and carefully closed it. For a moment, it seemed to me that this was the end. The old will had been read, roles assigned, curtain down. But the lawyer did not rise. Instead, he took out another envelope, smaller, thick, sealed, with a sharply standing inscription on the clean cardboard. Additional directive and letter to the will. A date was written on the edge in a clear, confident hand. A much more recent date than the one on the document just read. I didn't need to be a lawyer to understand. This was where the real thing was about to begin. Settle turned the envelope in his fingers for a moment, as if weighing the moment itself. Then he carefully tore the thick paper along the fold, took out a thin folder, and placed it on top of the will that had just been read. "What we have just read," he said quietly, "was the primary, original will of Jennifer Benny's." He lightly tapped the thick folder with his knuckles. "And this," he laid his hand on the thin, yellowish cover, "is an additional directive, a legally notarized addendum to the will, drawn up and signed several weeks ago, approximately 1 week before the stroke. And in it, in a separate clause, it is stated that all provisions concerning the distribution of the main estate are to be replaced." Kaylee blinked in confusion. John leaned forward slightly. The color drained from Stuart's face, not pale, but gray, like ash. Just moments ago, he had already sorted everything he'd heard in his head, planned to lease half of it, mortgage the other half, calculated how much he could squeeze out of the brand. And now he was being told the game wasn't over. The final whistle hadn't blown yet. What do you mean, replaced? He asked hoarsely. What does that mean? I mean, how? Literally. Literally, Settle replied calmly. Everything concerning the main body of assets will be reread in a new version based on this document. He opened the folder. Inside were only a few pages. On top lay a thick, almost cream-colored sheet with Jennifer's uneven handwriting. One word stood out immediately. Letter. Here, he explained, are not only formal legal provisions. This is a letter from your mother, addressed personally to you, Stuart Watson, with a legal note. Read aloud in the presence of all parties. Stuart tried to smirk. Why do I need her sentimentality? He tossed back. The main thing's already been read. Shares, companies, apartments. Sit down. Settle cut him off in that familiar steel tone. You will hear everything. This is also part of the document. Stuart dropped back into his chair, but not the relaxed way he had before, more like collapsing after his leg had been kicked out from under him. His fingers clenched into a tight knot. Settle adjusted his glasses, looked at the first page, and began to speak in a different voice, quieter, without the dry legal sharpness. To my son, Stuart, he read. I am writing this because I am finally tired of being a coward. For many years, I allowed you to believe a convenient lie. A lie I invented myself, fed myself, and used to escape my own guilt. The room seemed to grow colder. Even Kaylee stopped rustling in her dress and froze. The story, Settle continued, in which your father is a criminal, a scoundrel, and a failure who supposedly deceived me, stole my company, and ruined my life. A fabrication from beginning to end. Everything was the opposite. Stuart jerked as if he'd been slapped with a wet rag. Nonsense, he exhaled. She wasn't in her right mind when she wrote this. You said it yourself. Stroke, age. He suddenly pointed at me. He got into her head. That woodshop nobody wormed his way back into her life, talked about love, about the past, and then she… Enough, Settle cut him off, raising his hand. In his other hand, he already held a thick document tied with a blue ribbon. There is an attachment for that situation, he said evenly. At your own initiative, by the way. Stuart blinked, confused. A few days before this directive was signed, the lawyer said in a businesslike tone, at your request, Stuart, a full psychoneurological and cognitive evaluation of Jennifer was conducted by a commission of 3 independent specialists. A report spanning many pages, signed by all members of the commission, and officially sealed. He opened the document and glanced briefly at the text. I will quote the key conclusion. Consciousness clear, oriented in place, time, and personal identity. Critical thinking preserved. Full ability to understand the meaning of her actions and to direct them. The patient is capable of consciously managing her property and understands the consequences of her decisions. He looked up. Your own signature is here, Stuart, he reminded him gently. You initiated the examination, so the question of whether she was in her right mind is closed. For a second, something like pure panic flashed in my son's eyes. Then he clenched his teeth so hard they audibly ground. We continue, Settle said, returning his gaze to the letter. This lie, he read, was convenient for both of us. For you, because in it, you were the victim, and the world was divided into a good mother and a bad father. For me, because it was easier not to look in the mirror. I destroyed my own business, made mistake after mistake, but I told you it was all his fault. I sat without moving. Every word struck old scars that had long since closed, and yet the pain answered back, sharp and alive. I divorced him, Settle read on, left him, and allowed you, our son, to treat him like trash. I agreed when you called him an old failure and a parasite. I put those words into your mouth myself, because I was afraid that if you ever learned the truth, you would look at me with the same contempt. My fingers trembled. I clasped my hands together, squeezing until my knuckles turned white. There were no tears. They had been burned out years ago. Instead, there was something else, heavy but straightening, like having your spine put back into place. I was a coward, Stuart. Jennifer's voice continued through Settle. I allowed you to grow up empty, greedy, convinced that the world owed you by default. I gave you a convenient fairy tale where someone else was always to blame. And worst of all, I allowed you to hate the only person who truly burned his life down so that you could have all this. Settle paused for a moment, took a breath, and then read clearly, syllable by syllable. My entire current empire, all these millions you were so impatient to take, exists for one reason only, because your father, George Watson, saved it. Kaylee sucked in a sharp breath. John froze like a wax figure. Stuart didn't move at all. He just stared at one spot on the tabletop, like a schoolboy being read from his report card in front of the entire class. And I was no longer fully in that room. Jennifer's voice, the rasp of thick paper, the heavy smell of polish, all of it blended together, and in a single pull, like a draft, I was dragged back into another night, another space. I was no longer sitting at that massive lacquered table. I was back in our old apartment in an expensive building on the outskirts of Seattle. It was that dull, pre-dawn hour when the city hasn't woken up yet. No cars, just a few courtyard lights glowing. The apartment was dark, except for the harsh light of a desk lamp in Jennifer's office. I had gone in then because I heard her sobbing. She wasn't crying. It was worse. She sat absolutely motionless in her chair, facing an entire wall of monitors filled with tables, numbers, charts. Her face was deathly pale, empty, like a blank sheet of paper. "Jennifer," I called softly. "What happened?" She didn't turn her head. Only her lips moved slightly. "It's over, George," she whispered. "It's all over." Numbers, graphs, spreadsheets, emails from banks and investors flickered across the screens. Our company, her beloved creation, Benny's architecture and design, the very firm she had pulled from a half-basement level to glossy magazine covers, was bleeding money. It was breaking her in half. "I pushed too far," she said dully. "Invested in that damn resort. With the wrong partners, the wrong people. The documents are fake. The permits are fake. It's all built on sand. And the banks want their money back. Investors are threatening lawsuits. They won't stop until they burn everything to the ground." She spoke like someone describing her own execution, already feeling the rope around her neck. "I'm not afraid of being broke," she added in a whisper. "We lived on pasta before. I'm afraid of something else. They'll turn me into a joke. They'll say I'm nothing, a fraud. All these years, this whole legend of the flawless Benez, gone, in front of the entire industry." I looked at the woman I had spent the best and worst years of my life with, the mother of my son, this brilliant, frantic, sometimes unbearable Jennifer who never knew how to live halfway. And I understood, she wasn't just afraid of bankruptcy. She was being torn apart by the fear of public disgrace, the fear of being pointed at. "They're already whispering about criminal negligence," she forced out. "About fraud. Do you understand? They're ready to go all the way." A few days after that night, the house turned into a tomb. The phone rang almost nonstop. Banks, credit committees, furious investors. Jennifer could sit calmly in the living room, staring at nothing, while in the next room the phone screamed like a fire alarm. She didn't pick it up. Then the saviors showed up. With connections, smiles, business cards without titles. They offered a simple deal. They would bring in a large sum of money, save the firm from immediate collapse, and in return, we would take on their projects. Build for them using deliberately inflated estimates, run extra millions through the accounts of their shell companies. They brought in dirty money, and we pretended it was normal payment for work. They needed a big, well-known company with a clean name. They believed Jennifer's name was the perfect bleach. "This isn't an investment," I told her back then in her office. looking at the neatly stacked folders on the desk. "This is laundering. They want to use us as a washing machine." "You don't understand anything." She shook her head desperately. "They're bringing real cash. They're saving everything. We pay off the banks, get the lawsuits dropped. Have you seen the numbers? I have no other way out." I laid out the scheme for her as best I could. Talked about offshore accounts, fake contractors, about how money like that always comes with people you can't hide from in court. I told her that if she signed, this was no longer about business risk. This was organized crime. She paced the office like an animal in a cage, grabbing at her hair at the edge of the desk. "I can't go to prison," she finally burst out. Her voice sounded strange, rough. "I wouldn't survive it. You know me. I'd break in there." She sucked in a shaky breath. "And Stuart," she choked, as if the name caught in her throat. "Can you imagine what would happen to him? He's at the best university, he has internships, a future. Do you want his mother to be a convicted fraud? For him to be known everywhere as that woman's son? He'll hate us. He barely talks to you as it is. This way he'll hate us both." She was trapped. If she refused the deal, they could tear her apart for old mistakes. If she agreed, she stepped into a deeper pit. She had built herself a prison with no doors. I watched her sink onto the carpet. This woman who could outshout any room, negotiate with any official, pull projects up from nothing, simply folded like a rag doll on the soft pile and buried her face in her hands. "George, please," she whispered, gasping. "Tell me what to do. I don't know anymore." That was the moment that would come back to me for years in nightmares. A second where her freedom, the company's name, our son's future, and my own life, my honor, my craft, were all on the scales. I looked at her, the woman I loved and who could drive me mad in the same breath, the mother of my child, and I made a decision that burned through all the years that followed like acid. I lifted her off the floor, set her upright, gripped her shoulders. "Enough," I said evenly, in a calm voice that didn't sound like mine. "Stop crying. Go to the bedroom, lie down, and pretend nothing is happening." She looked up at me with swollen eyes. "What?" "You won't be involved in this," I said. "You won't sign a single page. You won't go to a single meeting. Your name won't appear in any email. You'll do what you're good at: design, presentations, being the face of the company. You'll smile at receptions and give interviews." I picked up the leather folder with the contracts, where her last name was printed first. "And everything else," I said, feeling something crack inside me. "Leave to me. I'll be the ghost walking through those offices." I became that ghost. In the months that followed, I went into offices where I used to sit next to Jennifer as a partner and signed papers alone, without her. My voice was the one heard in meetings with those saviors. I sat across from people with soft hands, expensive watches, and empty eyes, people who were never personally responsible for anything. I listened as they smoothly explained schemes, optimization, how everyone does this, how it's a matter of flexibility, not morality. I nodded, bargained over details but not the core. The core had already been decided that night when Jennifer sat on the carpet, fingers tangled in her hair, whispering that she wouldn't survive prison. I carved out a little more air for us, a little less risk, but I didn't remove the noose itself. We opened companies where the line, director and signatory, carried my name. We moved money for nothing, sold consulting at the price of golden bridges. Extra lines appeared in estimates, and extra blocks of concrete appeared on construction sites, blocks that no one ever actually poured. Every document bore my autograph, my signature, my handwriting. I kept specific sums, specific names, specific agreements from Jennifer. She knew we'd stepped into a gray zone, but she didn't see the black underneath. I deliberately put her in the display window and hid her from the back alley. "You're betraying me," she would sometimes say when another letter came from the tax authorities or another hint from a bank. "You're doing everything your way." I'm doing it so you can get up in the morning, put on your dress, and drive to the office, I answered. Not sit behind bars. I remember the day they came with searches. By then, it was already clear this couldn't go on forever, that somewhere, deep down, someone had decided it was time to sacrifice the pawns. They rang the doorbell early in the morning when Stuart was getting ready for classes. Jennifer stood in the kitchen with a mug of coffee, wearing a robe. My dirty boots lay on the floor. I'd just come back from a meeting and hadn't even changed. After that, everything happened fast and slow at the same time. People in strict suits, document boxes, protocols, long, freezing searches. I saw Stuart's face in the hallway, pressed to the wall, backpack in his hands, eyes huge. He wasn't looking at the badges or the lifted folders. He was looking at me. And in that look, the very legend Jennifer would later feed him was already being born. Then came interrogations. Interrogations. More interrogations. They wrung me out like a wet rag, asking the same questions 10, 20 times, probing where testimony would break, where a name might surface. I understood. If I ever once out loud tied our rescue schemes to the people who brought them, I'd be discarded like used material, and Jennifer would be burned along with me. I sat across from the investigator, drank cheap tea in the interrogation room, looked at my palms with faded bruises from handcuffs, and thought of only one thing: how much longer to hold. At some point, when our lawyers and people somewhere above finally reached an understanding, I was offered a choice. Very simple, very honest in its filth. Either we turn this into a loud case with lots of names, where Jennifer and the suitcase carriers go down too, or we narrow the scope, admit specific episodes, frame it as if I alone, a greedy, reckless executive who lost his way, crossed into fraud to save the company. Then it ends faster and quieter. Maybe I get a sentence I can survive, maybe even suspended. But the key thing, the rest of the people fade into the background. If you stay silent, my lawyer told me then, a man with a tired face and very attentive eyes, we can ease your wife out cleanly. She'll be, let's say, mistaken but not malicious. And your son, no one will touch him. He looked at me over the folders. It's your decision. I won't pretend to be a hero. I didn't throw myself on the barricades for lofty ideals. I sat at night in an empty room, listening to Stuart sleep behind the wall, to Jennifer turning in bed, and replayed the same image over and over. My boy standing in a university hallway, whispers around him, pointing fingers, headlines with his mother's name in bold. Then another image, me alone on the defendant's bench with my lawyer, the neighboring benches empty. And I made a decision, the dirtiest and the most honest decision of my life. In court, everything sounded as if the script had been written by someone who genuinely hated me. I was presented as the main culprit, the man who had supposedly run all the schemes almost in secret, behind the back of a saintly, clueless wife. I admitted to part of the charges to remove the harshest wording from Jennifer. The prosecution, satisfied, got what it wanted. The newspapers that had praised the brilliant Bennies and her firm just yesterday now ran pieces about shady contractors, but in the opening lines, there was only one name: mine. Jennifer sat in the courtroom, in the front row. She wore a strict dark suit, her face composed, almost tragic. She played the role of the deceived wife without a single flaw. She played it well. She knew how. I don't know how many of the tears she shed were real and how many were for the audience. At one point, when everything was already clear, when I had admitted my mistakes and the judge was reading the verdict, she looked at me. I remember that look to this day. It held everything at once: fear, hatred, gratitude, relief, unbearable exhaustion, and a deep cowardice, the very one she was now writing about in her letter. In the end, the sentence I got wasn't one you never come back from. Part of it was replaced with restrictions, part with fines, part with the confiscation of everything that could be taken. Much more important was something else. They stripped me of the right to practice my profession, banned me from managing anything, crossed out the license that had been my ticket into a world where I meant something. They erased my name from the industry, turned me into a convenient scapegoat, removed along with all the shame. We sold the house, the car too. What little remained was enough for a small place outside the city, where the workshop later appeared. Jennifer, who kept her clean image for journalists, rose fairly quickly on a new wave. The people who once brought us suitcases of money didn't let her drown. She was allowed to stay in the game. That firm had to be buried, but a new one grew from the ruins. It would be naive to think she did it without outside help. But the fact remained. She surfaced again, and I sank to the bottom. They brought Stuart to court once, at the final hearing. I didn't need to hear what his mother told him. I already knew the script. That his father had confessed to everything, that he had ruined their lives, dragged her into the dirt, that she now had to rebuild everything from scratch, and that he, the poor boy, was suffering. I saw his face as they led me out of the courtroom. There was no longer a question of why in his eyes. There was a ready, convenient, "It's all clear." He didn't come up to me, didn't say a word. He just turned away when I tried to catch on to something familiar with my gaze. After the trial, Jennifer and I finalized the divorce. Quickly, dryly, officially. She insisted on terms under which I left the marriage with minimal rights. I no longer cared. I stood in an office hallway with a ballpoint pen, signing my name, and only one thing was pounding in my head. Just let this heavy wheel I had set in motion not crush Stuart. Then came a long, sticky period when I tried, at least sometimes, to call my son, to write, to suggest meeting, explaining, saying at least part of the truth. Every time I hit a wall built by Jennifer. He rarely answered, spoke coldly, in borrowed phrases, as if reading a memorized script. A few times he snapped and called me the same words he had heard from his mother. At some point I understood. While Jennifer was alive, and while it was convenient for him to believe her, I had no chance. I stopped trying, simply switched that channel off inside myself, like turning off the light in an empty room. That's how I ended up where I was on the day of his call, in a small workshop, with a plane, wood shavings, my own mistakes in my pocket, and someone else's legend hanging around my neck. Settle's voice yanked me back into the conference room, as if he had pulled an invisible rope. "He signed," he read in Jennifer's voice, "because I asked him to. He went to meetings with people I was afraid to face. He took all the dirt onto himself so I could keep my face, and so you, Stuart, would not live with the stigma of being a fraud son. He saved not only the firm, he saved both of us." The room was so quiet you could hear a relay click somewhere inside the air conditioning unit. "I allowed," he continued, "everything to look as if it was he who destroyed our life. I stayed silent in court. I stayed silent after. When you came to me with questions, I denied every one of my decisions, every push I gave him. I allowed you for years to spit in your father's direction and even poured oil on the fire when it suited me." I couldn't see Stuart's face. He was sitting half-turned away from me, staring at the table. But from the way his shoulders tensed, the slight tremor in his fingers, I knew every word was hitting him. Maybe not sinking in yet, maybe he was holding his defenses with all his strength, but he felt the blow. "This is my greatest sin before you." Her handwriting spoke through someone else's lips. "Not that I made mistakes in business. Not that I got involved with people I shouldn't have. Not that I chose money and fame over quiet. My greatest sin is that I made you blind. I handed you a convenient enemy in the face of your father so you wouldn't notice the real enemy, my cowardice and your greed." Settle broke from the text for a second, looked over his glasses at Stuart as if checking whether he was listening at all, then returned to the letter. "Now, as I write these lines," it said, "I have little time. I feel it in my body. My mind is still holding on, but my hands already disobey me at times. My speech falters. You yourself insisted on the examination to make sure I wasn't a crazy old woman. Well, the commission confirmed it. I am of sound mind. And in that sound mind, I am telling you, your father is not the man I forced you to see. I slowly exhaled. My chest felt heavy and empty at the same time, as if someone had held your face in the dirt for 15 years and then suddenly lifted you by the collar and showed you that around you there is a field, sky, air. Only you can't stand up right away anymore. He is not a saint, Settle read without stopping. He has his own character, his own mistakes, his own pride. He broke things too, shouted, left, came back. But in the story you are still living in, the roles are reversed. He did not destroy my life. He saved it, when I had already managed to destroy everything myself. Settle turned the page. And if I want to atone even a little for my guilt toward him and toward you, Jennifer had written, I must correct not only words, but facts. Truth needs more than confessions. It needs actions. He lifted his gaze and looked at us over the pages. Next, he said quietly, comes the actual directive on replacing the inheritance shares. He looked at Stuart. Here, Stuart, your mother does what she did not dare to do her entire life, and I would prefer that no one interrupt these lines. He made another pause, almost respectful, and returned to the text. I felt that old ember in my chest begin to warm again, the same one that stirred after Stuart's call. Jennifer wasn't just going to confess, she was going to put a different full stop on this story. And what kind of full stop it would be, I heard in the very next words. Settle turned the last page of the letter, let out a barely audible breath, and in a dry, businesslike tone added, Your mother's words, he said, serve as the moral and legal introduction to the final part. She stated directly that everything concerning the distribution of the main estate is subject to complete replacement. This is the final version of the 8th clause. He paused briefly. The room seemed to grow denser, even the air thickened. Stuart sat slumped in his chair like a wrung-out rag, his eyes red, not yet fully grasping the scale of what was happening. Kaylee and John seemed to turn into background objects, just two expensive silhouettes at the edges of the picture, collateral damage. So, Settle continued in the very voice used in court to pronounce a sentence, taking into account everything stated above, without embellishment or excuses, and attempting at least in part to compensate, by the only thing money can ever compensate, for the betrayal that can no longer be undone. He raised his eyes and slowly swept his gaze over all of us. The ticking of the clock on the wall suddenly became deafening. I, Jennifer Bennis, he read clearly, hereby declare the following to be my last will and testament. All residential and non-residential properties owned by me, wherever they may be located, all shares in the charter capital of organizations, all rights to trademarks and projects, all funds held in accounts, all securities, my art collection, and above all, the entire block of shares providing full control over Benna's architecture and design, this entire body of property, which by current estimates amounts to several $billion. He read this list as if he were dictating not a reward, but a sentence. It didn't sound like a gift. It sounded like weight, like a slab, like an entire house dropped onto someone's shoulders. Stuart didn't move. He collapsed into a gray, sunken shape. Kaylee stared at the table with glassy eyes. John seemed to have lost the ability to move at all. All of this, Settle continued, I bequeath, transfer, and assign. He stopped and raised his head. He did not look at Stuart, did not turn to his advisor, did not spare Kaylee a glance. His light eyes moved across the table, skipped over scattered pages and empty glasses, and stopped on me. We met each other's gaze, and in that brief, suspended moment, I felt with absolute clarity that my entire life was balanced on a thin beam, like a plank on a single nail. My workshop, the woods behind my house, my quiet years among boards and shavings, on one side. the predatory glass city I had once built and then tried to forget, on the other. I wasn't thinking about money. I wasn't thinking about winning over anyone. Only one thought kept pounding in my head. What have you done, Jennifer? Settle lowered his eyes back to the document and finished reading. To my former spouse, George Watson. The words didn't fall or hit the table. They hung in the air, as if written in light. I, the man in an old gray suit, the suit in which I had once listened to my sentence in another courtroom, the man who had come here for his own public execution, suddenly became the one onto whom an entire world had just been dropped. Somewhere to my right, a short, broken sob escaped. It was Stuart. But I couldn't turn my head toward him. I couldn't move at all. It felt as if the roof of this glass building had been torn off and the entire leaden sky of Seattle had collapsed onto my shoulders at once. Several billion. The entire Benez empire. This was not a gift. It was like a verdict, a demand to return to the world I had clawed my way out of into my quiet corner of shavings and walnut boards. My heart beat slowly, heavily, as if it were pumping not blood, but thick resin. Thankfully, Settle didn't stretch out the moment or launch into lofty speeches. He worked like a professional and seemed to spare me a little, understanding that what mattered here wasn't the number of zeros, but the reason they had suddenly appeared next to my name. This estate, he returned to the text, now to the legal portion of the letter, I transfer not as mercy and not as generosity, not as a reward, but as payment, as a belated, insufficient, I understand, compensation for the profession I allowed to be destroyed, for the honor I allowed to be stolen, and for the family I allowed to be broken by my cowardice. He read it calmly, without theater. But those lines I heard not with my ears, somewhere along my spine. I suddenly understood. Everything fell into place. This wasn't about the billions, not about offices, cars, or shares, not about glass, marble, or expensive chairs. This was her confession, nailed alive to paper with seal and signature, her admission, her "I'm sorry," spoken not in a kitchen whisper, but in a way that couldn't be thrown out, torn from the record, or forgotten. She wasn't just giving me the company. In the face of the law and this polished world, she was declaring, this entire structure exists only because, once, I stood between her and the fire, and that I was the one who saved her. She wasn't giving me money, she was giving me back my name. The very backbone that had been pulled out of my spine in a courtroom years ago. I lowered my gaze to my hands resting on the tabletop, black as water. Rough palms, covered in tiny cracks, old cuts, lacquer ground into the skin, nails worn down by sandpaper, hands darkened by work. Hands that had spent years guiding a plane across wood, feeling where the grain would tear and where it would peel clean. Hands made to build, not to sign verdicts and decrees. And now, by someone else's will, I was becoming the owner of an empire I had never needed. Several $1 billion pressed on my chest like a heavy iron hoop you can't slip out of. A new kind of shackles. But nearby, a little to the side, at the other edge of the table, among the piles of papers and folders, I noticed another detail, tiny, metallic. For a moment, something glinted in the light of the ceiling lamps. A small, simple key attached to a paper tag. Even before anyone explained anything, I felt it in my gut. This small object mattered more than it seemed. It looked like there was one final detail left in this story. Settle finished reading the last line of the directive, aligned the sheets neatly, as if closing a coffin lid, and slowly shut the thick folder containing the will and its addendum. The room fell quiet again. Even breathing was barely audible. That concludes, he said, lowering his voice slightly, the part concerning the distribution of the primary assets. I sat there, feeling the invisible weight on my shoulders grow heavier, while in my chest, where pain had just been boiling, Something rigid and straight slowly unfolded, as if a once bent vertebra had been set back into place. Across from me, Stuart had turned into a gray silhouette, gripping the armrests as if he could squeeze back from the wood everything that had just slipped out of his hands. Settle lifted the corner of another thin folder, checked the signatures, and placed it on top of the main one. "One remains," he said. "Your mother's personal directive regarding her son." He turned to Stuart. At the word son, Stuart jerked as if shocked. In his empty, dulled eyes, a tiny spark flared for a moment. Not hope, no, but bare instinct, the animal fear of being left with nothing at all. "We proceed," the lawyer said calmly, "to the inheritance designated for Stuart T. Watson." What I heard next was unexpected even for me. It was a blow that brought down walls Jennifer hadn't managed to destroy in her lifetime. Settle turned the page of the thin folder and spoke in that short, almost dry tone used to announce decisions that need no decoration. "Regarding my son, Stuart T. Watson," he read, "I, Jennifer S. Benez, hereby order the following." Stuart half rose, like a dog hearing the rustle of a bag. His voice hadn't returned yet. His eyes were red, but inside him, it was obvious. The familiar gears of calculation began to turn. If the main bulk was gone, then now would come the consolation prizes. A couple of apartments, a country house, a solid account, enough not to lose face. "To my son," Settle continued, "I leave no shares in companies and no rights to manage them. I leave him no controlling stakes and no executive chairs. He has had far too much power in his life already, power he did not earn." Kaylee let out a small, thin squeak. John lowered his eyes. It was as if Stuart had been punched in the solar plexus. He sank into the chair, his shoulders collapsing. "I am deliberately not transferring to him a single position of leverage," the lawyer continued reading, "because power that falls into the hands of an unprepared person cripples no less than prison. The life he has lived so far has shown. He must not be given control over other people's fates." He cleared his throat lightly and turned the page. "Instead," he went on quietly, "I leave him something he has never had, although he always believed otherwise, the chance to start his own life." Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the corner of Stuart's mouth twitch nervously. "To my son, Stuart," Settle read slowly and clearly, "I bequeath a personal bank account with a sum sufficient to live calmly for several years without luxury, but also without degrading need, on the condition that he stops trying to pretend to be someone he is not. This money is not meant for cars, restaurants, or showy trips, but to pay for a therapist, for education if he decides to truly learn something, and for the rent of modest housing while he figures out who he is without my millions." He paused and calmly added, "If my son chooses to continue living under the illusion that the world owes him everything and considers this arrangement an insult rather than a chance, I cannot stop him. In that case, he has the right to refuse the sum left to him." Stuart's face flared with blotches. "So," he croaked, "after everything, after what I did for her," his voice broke. "After what you lived off at her expense," Settle corrected him calmly. "That is exactly what it says there, just in different words." He lowered his gaze back to the document. "In addition," he continued, "my son receives ownership of my old country house in the state of Washington, the very one where he spent his childhood vacations, back when he could still be happy with nothing more than a river and the smell of a campfire." He looked at Stuart. "A house outside the city by the river," he explained in his own words. "Small, well-kept, with a plot of land and an old bathhouse. No security, no millionaire neighbors. An ordinary life." Something inside me jolted. I remembered that house. In our very first winter, Jennifer and I had ripped out rotten floorboards there with our own hands, hauled firewood, heated the stove, sealed the cracks. Stuart used to run around the yard in rubber boots, his nose red, treating every snowdrift like treasure. It felt like a very long time ago, almost in another life. With the house, Settle added, comes a small workshop and a shed with tools, which I, at Jennifer S. Benez's request, helped her buy out and register in advance. The letter specifies, if Stuart ever wants to learn to make at least a simple stool with his own hands, he will have a place to do it. A shadow of a smile flickered at the corner of the lawyer's mouth, then vanished. In conclusion, he finished reading, regarding my son, I express the following will. Everything else he so desperately desired, I deliberately leave to his father. I do not believe money will make Stuart better, but I still hope that knowledge of the truth and the chance to start from a clean slate will one day make him think. I am not punishing him with poverty. I am depriving him of the illusion that everything is owed to him. He looked at Stuart and said clearly, you always believed I did not love you enough. In reality, I loved you too much, overfed you, and crippled you by that. Now it is your turn to choose who you will be when all my money goes to the man who truly earned it. Settle lowered the pages and neatly placed them into the folder. That concludes, he said, the reading of the will and the additional directives. The silence that fell after his words was not just heavy, it was sticky, like fog over a swamp. No one moved. Even the air conditioner seemed to fall silent. Stuart broke first. He shoved his chair back so hard it screeched across the floor and jumped to his feet. His face twisted, his lips trembled, his eyes were bloodshot. This, he faltered, his throat tightening. This is a show, right? Another one of her circuses. He jabbed a finger at the folder. You think I'll believe this nonsense? The words fired out like corks, but ended in air. John tried to whisper something in his ear about challenging it in court, about checking legality, about undue influence. Kaylee no longer played the socialite. She sat hunched over, clutching her handbag to her chest like a shield. Settle listened to this broken stream without blinking. You have the right to challenge the will in court, he said calmly. No one is taking that right from you. But you understand, Stuart, any attempt to invalidate this directive will automatically call the original will into question as well. Everything will have to be reopened. Medical evaluations, criminal case materials, old financial audits. He paused almost imperceptibly. With all the details, he added distinctly, including those your mother so carefully kept from you. Stuart froze, as if he had run chest first into a wall. In that moment, I saw in him not a predator, not a smug heir to an empire, but a confused boy, cornered by adult life. His gaze shot to me. There was so much hatred, pain, and thick black resentment in it that I instinctively looked away. Not because I was afraid, but because I knew too well. No words would get through now. Everything there was buried under bricks from the years when I stayed silent, and Jennifer spoke for both of us. I hope you understand, he said almost in a whisper, addressing either me or the emptiness, that this isn't the end. This is the end of one lie, Settle replied calmly. Whether it becomes the beginning of something else is for you to decide. Stuart jerked as if struck, grabbed a pencil lying uselessly on the table, slammed it back down with a clatter, turned around, and walked out without even looking in my direction. Kaylee rushed after him, her heels catching on the polished floor. John lingered for a second, throwing me a look mixed with anger and fear, the look of a man whose mask had been torn off in public. Then he too left, pulling the door shut behind him. The lawyer and I were left alone. For a while, we simply sat in silence. The room finally became quiet in a human way. No expensive perfume, no performative laughs, no fingernails tapping on the table. Just breathing, the rustle of paper, the dull hum of the street beyond the glass. Please accept my... Settle began, but I raised my hand. No need, I said. She already said everything, the only way she could. He nodded, as if that was exactly what he wanted to hear. "From a legal standpoint," he said dryly, "your former wife's decision is almost impossible to challenge. Everything is clean. No rush. The evaluation was done in advance. Signatures, dates, notarized registration, all in order." He leaned slightly forward. "I'm not telling you this so you'll feel happy. Just so you understand, this burden won't be easy to shrug off. You'll have to do something with it." I gave a crooked half-smile. "Story of my life," I said. "I'm always carrying something." For a second, Settle allowed himself a faint smile, too. Then he pulled his face back into its professional mask and reached for the small paper tag with the key I had noticed earlier. "One more thing," he said. "For you personally." He slid the key toward me. "A safe deposit box," he explained. "Here, at a nearby branch. Inside are the documents transferring the shares, detailed financial reports Jennifer compiled over the last few years, and—" He paused slightly. "And a second letter. Just for you. No legal force. Just words." I looked at the small piece of metal on the cardboard tag, as if it were another nail meant to pin me even tighter to this new world, and suddenly understood very clearly, now was not the time to go there. Not because I wasn't curious about what she wrote, but because if I dove back into the past right now, I might not find my way out. I took the key and put it in my pocket. "Thank you," I said. "I'll deal with it." Settle nodded. "You'll have other questions," he added in a businesslike tone. "About management, taxes, transferring operations. You can hire managers, you can sell, you can shut down parts of the assets, you can, I interrupted, "but not today." I stood up. My legs felt weak, but they held steady. The gray suit I was wearing suddenly stopped feeling like just old clothes. It became something like armor, scuffed, dented, but still capable of taking a hit. "One thing I know for sure right now," I said, looking at the black surface of the table. "I'm not going to do with this money what the people who accumulated it did. I won't build another glass fortress where people measure each other by suits and humiliate anyone weaker." I paused, searching for the right words. "If I've been handed this kind of payment," I went on, "I'll try to give it back in a way that lets at least some of the poison out. Return it to those who got crushed along the way." Settle looked at me carefully. "There's a list of people in the letters," he said quietly. "Employees she once abandoned, contractors she underpaid, partners whose lives were flattened while she was climbing up. She left notes. If you want, you can start with them." I nodded. Something inside clicked into place. "We'll start with them," I said. "Then we'll see." We shook hands. His grip was firm, without pressure, like a man used to dealing with heavy decisions. I walked out into the corridor. The lobby was already half empty. The receptionist, the same woman who had looked at me like a random passerby earlier, raised her eyes. And to my surprise, there was no trace of that faint contempt or boredom now. Instead, there was cautious respect mixed with curiosity, as if she had witnessed something she would later retell to her co-workers. I nodded to her and stepped outside. The cold air burned my lungs. A low, leaden sky hung over the bay, and the wind cut straight through. The glass facade of the firm reflected my silhouette, a small figure in an old suit against a massive, faceless slab. I thought that just yesterday this building would have seemed like a temple of money to me, and now it looked like an ordinary office, just absurdly expensive. I walked to the station instead of calling a taxi. I went along the waterfront, through narrow streets, past shop windows, past people hurrying about their business, and with every step I felt that glass world falling farther behind me. In one pocket, the key to the safe deposit box lay heavy and silent, along with my new, strange world that I'd just been pushed into. Into the other pocket, I slid my hand and felt loose change, the very $20 Stuart had supposedly meant to leave me for the trip. Somewhere inside, a thread snapped quietly. the one he had tried to use to tie me to my humiliation. The commuter train back looked the same, but I was different inside it now. Outside the window, gray fields ran past again, sparse stations, gas stations, warehouses. People sat buried in their phones, some nodded off. Ordinary life. The same life I had lived all these years, and the one I was now returning to, not as a loser, but as a man who had unexpectedly been given far more power than he wanted. The only difference was that now I had a choice in how to use it. By the time I entered my yard, dusk was settling in. The dim light of a street lamp clung to the peeling fence. On the cherry branches hung a few dark leaves, blackened by the cold. The workshop stood exactly where it always had. The smell of shavings and varnish hit my nose the moment I opened the door. Inside, nothing had changed. The unfinished rocking chair lay on the workbench, shavings along the edges, tools neatly arranged, the plane frozen mid-stroke. My small kingdom of wood and light. I took off my jacket, carefully hung it on a nail, rolled up my sleeves, and picked up the plane. The wood met me with its familiar resistance, the soft hiss of shavings immediately calming my blood. There were no billions in that sound, no wills, no court rulings, just me and the board, just the line that had to be drawn straight. I worked for a while until my hands went numb. The fatigue wasn't from strain, but from a strange sense of release. Then I set the plane down, wiped my palms, and stepped out onto the porch. The sky had gone fully dark, a pale pink strip glowing over the forest. I sat on the step, and for the first time in a long while, allowed myself not to think about the past or the future. Just to sit. Somewhere far off on the highway, the sound of a car stretched out into the night. A couple of minutes later, headlights appeared at the gate, a beat-up sedan, not the kind you see in magazines. The car stopped, the lights went out. A door slammed. Stewart appeared in the gateway. He walked slowly, hands in his pockets, without his perfect coat, just a simple jacket. His face was pale, his eyes burned out. There was still a lot in him of the man who had tried to humiliate me that morning in the glass lobby, but something in his walk had changed. There was a heaviness you can't fake. We stood there for a while, silently looking at each other across the yard. Then, without coming closer, he said, "I didn't come to ask you for money." His voice was rough, worn down. "Good," I replied. "That's already a decent start." He gave a short, joyless smirk. "I don't believe she made all this up by herself," he breathed out. "And I don't believe you're some kind of saint either." He shrugged. "But—" He hesitated, searching for words. "But if she decided to lay everything out like this, I need at least one person who'll tell me what part of it is true and what part she twisted to make it easier for herself." I slowly stood up from the step. "There are no saints here, Stewart," I said. "Not her, not you, not me. Just people who once made too many cowardly decisions in a row." He lowered his gaze. "I don't know what to do with that house or with those—" He waved his hand. "Money for a therapist. I don't know what to do with you." He looked up. "But I do know I need to hear the story at least once, not from her mouth, so I can decide for myself who to hate and who not to." There was no request for forgiveness in his words, no ready-made reconciliation either, just an honest, painful admission. He had lost the ground under his feet and didn't know what to do next. I looked at him, at the grown man in whom I could still see that boy who once sneered at a handmade battleship and demanded a brand-name toy, and understood I could give him only one thing. "Come in," I said, nodding toward the workshop. "There's a chair. Sit down. I'll tell you how it was, how I saw it. Then you'll go and decide for yourself what to do with it." I paused. "But I'll warn you right away. There won't be any pretty fairy tales. Not about a saintly mother or a heroic father. There will be dirt, fear, and a few decisions none of us can be proud of." He stood there for a few more seconds, hesitating. Then he stepped forward, crossed the yard, climbed onto the porch. He smelled of city smoke, someone else's perfume, expensive but already fading cologne, and something else, new and unfamiliar even to him. Doubt. I opened the workshop door and let him inside. He entered carefully, as if afraid to touch anything, and sat on the chair by the wall where my regular clients usually rested. I took my place at the workbench. Between us lay a board, a plane, and an entire life, broken, glued back together, cut again by other people's hands. And now I finally had a chance to at least try to draw a straight line across it. There, in the small workshop on the edge of the settlement, under the dim light of a lamp and the smell of walnut shavings, one story was coming to an end. The story of a lie that had stretched on for many years. And another was beginning, one in which each of us, for the first time, had a chance to speak the truth without hiding behind billions or colorful legends. And the will had already done its job. If you liked this story, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To listen to the next story, click the window on the left. Thank you for watching.